So good afternoon, 'cause it's afternoon. I'd like to get an idea as to who's in the room. How many graduate students do we have? Graduate students? So the vast majority. Okay, faculty? Any faculty? Hi. Staff? Wonderful. Wonderful. Undergrads? Any undergrads here? Yeah. Represent, thank you, good. Okay, so I'm a professor in Women and Gender Studies, which is in the School of Social Transformation by way of education. I want to give a really brief history as to how I got to this place because my background is education. I'm a social scientist, sociology of education, sociology of children and childhoods, in fact, even though I finished my dissertation many, many moons ago. But when I was working in what was considered a special needs district, that's what we called it back east, I was acutely aware of some of the issues that we now have done a relatively good job of documenting, and specifically how certain children were treated as if they were really not going to go anywhere, that they really didn't deserve the most exemplary practices, that you could kind of just do whatever you wanted with them because they're really not going to succeed. And that bothered me to such an extent that that caused me to say, you know, I want to go back to school. I loved being in the classroom. I loved what I called lumpkins, but at the same time, I said, imagine, or at least I would have wanted to imagine the impact I could have if I was working with ed leaders. Superintendents, assistant superintendents, then it could be exponential. So I did, I went back, got my degree at Rutgers, and then started in ed leadership and policy studies at Hofstra University, where I got tenured, and then moved out here. ASU wooed me enough to move out here to the surface of the sun. That's what I call it. And I've been here about 11 years, 11 academic years. So just a little bit about me. I'd like this to be interactive. So please stop me, ask questions. Usually when I'm teaching a class, I give myself about 8 minutes before I get bored listening to myself, and then I ask a question. So please, please, please ask questions. So I just wanted to set the stage a little bit with some statistics that I'm sure you have all seen. But I am really in love with looking at research and statistics and questioning why and how did we get to that point, because I believe that statistics and numbers are really important for setting the stage, but not necessarily telling the whole story, right? So as we look here from 2005 to 2014, and this is for women who earned their computer science degrees, and we're talking about their bachelor's. What I found really disturbing is the decrease of, in particular, African American, Black, and white women. Slight increase for Hispanic, Latina, decrease again for Asian American, Pacific Islanders, a decrease again for Native American, Alaskan Natives. And yet this is in spite of an incredible push by the federal government in giving more and more money in between 2005 and 2014 to broaden participation. This is in spite of one federal agency, I won't name it because it's one of my funders, but gave about allocated $12.4 million in 1 year specifically for broadening participation, but yet these numbers don't look so good. They don't look so good. We're seeing a decline. And so the reason for the decline, I mean, we oftentimes thought, okay, well maybe it's just the bachelor's degrees. Maybe it looks better in workforce. No, it really does not look better in the workforce. If we're looking at science and engineering occupations, this is based on 2015 data, but recorded in 2017, that we're not representative, meaning the percentage of women, and particularly women of color, African American, Asian American, Latina women, is not representative of our percentage of the total population in the United States. And so, for me, in my sociological mind, I say, why? It's not because of lack of interest. That's an argument that's not only disturbing, but it's been debunked. Is to believe that a certain segment of the population is simply not interested or not motivated to go into the fastest growing of fields is problematic, to say the least. In fact, the Girl Scouts, they did a report, Intel has done a report that shows African American and Latina girls in particular are oftentimes more interested in STEM fields, particularly around the ages of 11, 12, 13. I have an 11-year-old, almost 12-year-old, and she's really into science, loves it, hates math. Hate to tell her that the two go hand in hand. And so what happens, when she becomes 12 and 13, is we see a drop because of several different types of reasons. And so some of those reasons, and you'll wonder why I have Charlie Brown, and it'll become obvious in a minute, is a lot of the programs that agencies and foundations are funding, they assume what we call a deficit approach. Meaning we construct programs, unfortunately, that assume we have to save these populations, that we as external individuals need to come in and give these people, and I'm purposely using the term these people, something that they don't have. Just by the mere word intervention. What do? You intervene when something negative is happening. So when we use the term intervention, which is often how we describe these initiatives, we're using a deficit approach, that they don't have assets on which to build. Also, what I see is, and this goes to the Charlie Brown syndrome, a colleague of mine and I wrote a piece about this. Now, how many people remember Charlie Brown? Okay, good. How were the adults represented? Exactly. We never saw the adults. They were these bodiless. You couldn't understand what they were saying. Well, a lot of times when we're working with underrepresented communities, we assume a Charlie Brown approach. We don't include parents and community members because we're focusing on the kids. That's a little problematic. We're thinking about making a systematic change in the way that we think about inclusivity in this digital age. And then finally, I like to argue in my research about the single or narrow unit of analysis. Oftentimes we see programs that say, we are interested in gender. And what does that mean? If you think of gender, what do you think of? Girls. Gender is not synonymous with girls, right? And which girls? To assume that if we only work on gender without naming which girls or which women, it discounts and diminishes the other sociocultural variables that make us who we are. And so we're narrowing our programs not only by saying we're intervening with these poor communities and then not including everyone within the ecosystem of the individual's lives, but then thinking in terms of a limited stance. We'll deal with gender, maybe we'll deal with race. But to talk about dealing with other elements, that gets a little too messy and unfortunately is not always operationalized. So keeping in mind these distilled ideas as to why I think the numbers are as they are, what we've done in the center is taken theory and conceptual frameworks, synthesized it in my work over about 20 years, and said, okay, what are some of the highlights that we can use in terms of implementing programs and evaluating the success of our programs? And so the first is critical feminist theory, which I of course adore. There's lots of aspects of critical feminist theory, so I'm only going to focus on three. Intersectionality. I was giving a talk and I said intersectionality. People sat there and they said, oh yeah, we know what you're talking about. And I said, well, let me be disruptive for a moment. Is when I think about intersectionality, I think particularly of Patricia Hill Collins' newest book, Intersectionality. If you haven't read it, it's a good one, with her colleague Bilge, where she says intersectionality is not only about taking a couple of variables and mixing them up in a pot and assuming that because we've done that, we can level the playing field. She says we can't level the playing field because it's so skewed. Instead, we need to think about intersectionality as a framework that has several guideposts, one of which is we need to think about approaches that are focused on power as a relationship. So where you are in the nexus, where you are in the hierarchy, we need to examine that positionality in terms of access to power or resources that can make you powerful or not. And that means we need to think about the social context as well, and that'll become hopefully clear in a moment. The coalition building from critical feminist theory, I think, is also really important, because a lot of times we think that we can come up with our solutions to grand problems if we are in a common sphere. And coalition building is saying, no, we need to actually work and highlight our differences and create a coalition that is based on difference. That's different than inclusion. If you want to hear my metaphor about diversity, equity, inclusion, ask. And then standpoint theory, it's about naming, and particularly getting individuals that we are hoping to enhance their access to resources, having them name their reality, having them name our impact, having them name and also co-create those spaces. Culturally responsive computing, from that and the work that I've done, we're talking about three pivotal elements: asset building, reflection, and connectedness. And I'll give some examples. And then girlhood studies, which is, it's born from feminist studies. And when we think about girlhood studies, we're talking about girls' identity practices, how girls in particular social spaces engage in the formulation of their identities. Plural, not just one identity. Yes, I did a little longer than 7, but thank you.
I was gauging 8 minutes. Now that you got to this point, my question is, the first slide you showed, it was what, from 2009 to 2015 in slight decline. Mm-hmm. Okay, where, now when you say girlhood studies, where does social media fit into these? As social media has taken off, where is there a correlation between, you know, girls, young ladies going, hey, I really like STEM, but now there's social media, and my peer, it's not the adults, it's the peers at their level going, you don't want STEM, you know, that's not for you. So where does that fit?
I hear two separate questions. One is the peer effect, and then one is social media. So I'm going to divorce the two and hopefully respond accordingly. So the peer effect is really important, and we know this particularly when they are getting into the tween years, 11, 12, and 13. And again, in the research that I've conducted and the syntheses I've seen is that particularly, well, let me go back. There's this belief, there's this myth that African American and Latina girls and their communities are technophobic. And this is an actual term, that they are actually, the peers are diminishing each other from entering. What we find is that that's not the whole story, is that when given the opportunity to engage in a particular kind of STEM experience, such as CompuGirls, which I'll talk about, in which the girls can create a safe space for themselves and their peers, they're incredibly encouraging, sometimes to a fault. And so I think that we have to do more to create context in which girls can feel empowered to the extent that they own that space, and at the same time own the space to, again, name themselves and become what I call technosocial change agents, meaning they are not simply taught to use technology, but how to manipulate it. That is where I think the peer effect, like, hey, I can do this, so can you. And I have lots and lots of data that talks about that. The social media, that's a more difficult question, because you're right, there's been an uptick of a lot of social media. There has been some interesting things done in terms of how to use Twitter and how to use other social networking sites to increase. But I will say this, I think one of the problems is assessing the impact. And so we have all these wonderful digital narratives, and we have all these tweets, and we have all this social media. There hasn't been enough done using an intersectional approach on how these devices and how these connections are impacting kids' use of, it's particularly, again, my interest, women of color, girls of colors, perceptions of STEM, not longitudinally. And that's where I think we need to start moving. We can do short-term impact, and inevitably, if you're exposed to something and it's really cool. You get really excited about it, and you may engage in it for 6 weeks or maybe a year, but if you don't have opportunity to continue that engagement beyond that year, what happens? And that's where we're, I think, missing the boat in terms of the research. So, ecosystem approach. So, I said the word system, I guess, about 3 times. I really do believe that we need an ecosystem approach, that if we're really going to talk about broadening participation, particularly for African American, Native American, Latina, and Asian American girls and women in science, technology, engineering, and math, we need to think about changing the system. I personally hate the metaphor pipeline. Hate it. And when we say, oh, we want to populate the pipeline, with more underrepresented groups. First of all, the pipeline, it negates the point that it should be a pathway, and you all know this, right? That's number one critique. Second of all, so if it's a pathway, there's different ways to go in and out, just like you're on a path. There's different ways to go in and out. And it doesn't necessarily consider that we need to include lots of different people within the ecosystem so that we're attempting to do enrichment experiences. It's not just for the kids, but it's also for teachers, for their peers, going to your point, for industries, and I'll talk a little bit more about how I make sense of that. So the Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology is, I'll get to you in a moment, Gabriela, is a collective approach. It's not just me. There's a group of us. I'll just put the plug in there. I typically have internship lines, practicum lines, GA lines, postdoc lines. We are a research-based unit here at Arizona State University. So I'll often use the royal we, but it's not just because it's the royal we, because I am honored to lead a whole group of phenomenally intelligent people who are committed to these issues. Gabriela.
I was just going to ask you, in your ecosystem picture, when you talk about teachers, do you also talk about counselors, principals, and all the staff that's, because I think counselors play a major role as well. And I just assumed that it was sort of included in that, but just wanted to clarify.
Yes. Yes, and I'm doing, and this is like my last slide, I'm doing more and more work in terms of who should be identified, and it's pretty much everyone, including staff. That's why I wanted to find out who was in the room, is we oftentimes think, oh, we just have to work with teachers, or we just have to work with this group. We've got to work with everyone, which goes back to the point of creating a space where everyone can have a shared dialogue to hopefully equitable ends. But thank you. So there's 3 arms to the center. And I'll talk a little bit about each arm. I couldn't talk about everything we do in every single arm. So again, stop me if you want clarification. And I'll start with the capacity building arm. And just a little background for the capacity building, again, going back to the idea of asset building and an anti-deficit approach. When I talk about capacity building, we are supporting programs and developing enrichment experiences to build the capacity of communities. So I am not an advocate, nor will I develop a program or support a program that's about an external person always coming in and doing something to the community and then leaving. It's about how are we working ourselves into another job. So it's creating spaces where we have the opportunity to work with counselors, to work with principals, to work with postdocs, and students and parents to build their capacity so that they can take over our work and do it far better. And so that's capacity building. So just a couple of examples. CompuGirls, which is our most well-known program. It was started by me in 2006. I had a somewhat similar program when I was on faculty at Hofstra called Teaching, Learning, and Community. And when I moved out here to ASU, I redefined it, found wonderful new colleagues, and called it CompuGirls. And we got our first funding. I always say Arizona Community Foundation was our first funder. And then at the federal level, the National Science Foundation has been funding me since 2008. And so CompuGirls is a culturally responsive computational experience. And we have 4 courses, and we continue to play with these courses. Digital storytelling, that's typically the first course. Think like a programmer, design like a change agent. That's where the girls learn coding using Scratch. Virtual worlds for social change. We've used so many different types of virtual worlds. We finally just had someone develop our own. And then co-robotics for CompuGirls, that's the newest one. And so it sounds like a typical, tech program, but it's not. Because what we do is we ask the girls to first and foremost identify a community or social issue. And then we teach them how to analyze, describe, and provide recommendations to that issue. So whether it's peer sexual harassment, or whaling, or LGBTQ, or domestic violence, they learn how to interview individuals in a culturally responsive way, how to conduct surveys in a culturally responsive way, how to read peer-reviewed articles, how to assess whether pop culture articles are valid, how to question statistics, and then use the technology as a platform on which to present their journeys as researchers. And ultimately, every course concludes with what we call closing ceremony, where the girls invite individuals from the communities. One year they invited a congressperson, sometimes they invite the director at ASU in my school. It kind of depends, but always their families, to say, this is what I've learned, but this is what I want you to do about it. And that's CompuGirls. CompuPower is our newest program. It's currently funded by the U.S. Department of Education, I3, now called EIR. We just started that. And that is taken our out-of-school program. CompuGirls, it's national. We've been in California, Arizona, Colorado, Wisconsin, and New Jersey, and growing. But it's mainly been out of school. And so for sustainability purposes, we're translating what we've done out of school and saying, let's integrate it in school, and particularly high-needs schools. And that's what CompuPower is. But because it is the U.S. Department of Education, we have also been encouraged, I'll say, to be gender neutral. So we have invited both girls and boys. We're piloting this first year, the first course, and we are in 4 urban schools. Next year for rural schools, and the year after that about 60 to 90 schools between Arizona, what's next? Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. And the point of CompuPower is, again, to get the girls and boys to become what we call technosocial change agents. Because the belief is it's not enough to simply know the technology. It's not enough to simply code. It's not enough to simply build in the virtual world. How do you collaborate? How do you articulate your ideas in a way that's going to make change? How do you build that coalition? How do you critically analyze using the intersectional lens so that there can be the systemic change that we believe should happen? And then learning in libraries is a program. It's funded by IMLS, another federal agency, and that's my fun program. I love libraries. And so I was really excited to get this grant. It's taken our CompuGirls curriculum, modified it, and putting it in libraries. And we're in 3 library systems: Ypsilanti, Michigan, Imperial, and then Tempe. And we do that, and we just finished our first pilot. But it's about low-cost library systems in terms of providing library systems, low-cost CompuGirls in a way that can be adapted to the library context. And we don't have data per se on that one. Yes?
Just a curiosity, what age group is that those courses meet?
So, CompuGirls is typically ages 13 to 18. We have had some 11 and 12-year-olds, but I love the beauty of multi-age classrooms if done well, but because we're scaling, doesn't always work as well. And we are at the end of our scale-up grant, so we're analyzing the data over the past about 600 students, but it's typically 13 to 18. CompuPower is grade 10. Because it's in-school model, we're sticking in grade 10. The cool thing about CompuPower, which I failed to mention, going back to the point about the ecosystem, is the kids are in school, they're taking an enrichment class that counts towards their college readiness. They have access to mentors, individuals that we orient. And the reason that we do orientation for the mentors is one of our sponsors did such a great job of providing mentors, and they would come in and talk about their experiences being women and women of color in STEM and scare the hell out of the girls. The girls would first of all walk away and say, gosh, that was boring. And then secondly, they would say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go into that. And what we found is that the industry mentors need just as much training, and I don't really like the word training, but they need as much encouragement as all of us do. And so with the CompuPower program, we have the possibility and opportunity to create a mentor training that's culturally responsive for industry. And then the third part of CompuPower is residency. So the boys and girls will be coming here to ASU next summer for a week, and they will be working in groups across, obviously, geographic regions, and they will be hacking something that one of our industry mentors will have given them. So they themselves are coming to the table with all the skills that they have hopefully attained in the year-long program, and we're working with American Dream Academy here at ASU to have a parent piece. So the parent piece of CompuPower is such that we're revising with ADA's help how to support their sons and daughters to be college ready, and particularly think about STEM, not necessarily as a career, but as a competency that they must have to be successful in this digital age. So that's CompuPower. It's very early. We don't have any data, but we are looking at mainly quantitatively the non-cognitive skills, self-regulatory behavior, self-concept. For CompuPower, for learning in libraries, we're looking at computational thinking in particular, how well this culturally responsive curriculum is increasing the girls. And for learning in libraries, it's mainly 16 years of age, to your question. And then for CompuGirls, we've done mixed methods, and I've had, I don't know, about 10 grants over the years, and the question kind of determines what we're looking at, but it's usually mixed methods, and I'll share with you some actual data. Yes?
Quick question. Under CompuPower, I'm just curious, what age were the industry mentors that we're talking about?
Oh, interesting. I've never had that question. I don't know, because we're still recruiting them. Yeah, I don't know. I would, I mean, these are individuals. I'm thinking of some of our partners. They're adults. There's no one under 20, I'd say 5, probably. It's an interesting question. Yes?
For CompuPower, you said that the way this is going into these schools is through like an enrichment class, so it's not going to augment like a STEM class.
Yeah.
So what's your relationship or training, or how do you work with the schools and the teachers to get them to understand what you're trying to do?
Good question. So thank you for that question. One of the things we've done with both CompuGirl and CompuPower is say, we have a curriculum, we developed the curriculum in conjunction with a bunch of really brilliant people across the campus in computer science and engineering and SCS programs, and we have our curriculum, right? But then we mapped our curriculum onto next generation science standards and Common Core. I was at the National Academies of Science, and they called me to come in and do this presentation. And it was very odd. I was like, well, what do you want me to talk about? And they said, oh, we want you to talk about this work. And I get there, and they said, we want you to talk about how to encourage science lab experiments, something weird. I was like, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about this. And one of the things that became really important was how we aligned with Common Core standards and national next generation science standards. And we do. And there's an overlap. And every single, and I'll show an example, every single activity that we create for CompuPower, we see how it aligns with which standard. So that's a big selling point for the schools, whether they like the standards or whether it's Arizona, where our adoption of Common Core is different. That's a huge selling point. How do I work? This goes back to something I said a little earlier in terms of how I started in this field. I was a professor in leadership. And so now, fast forward, I have some phenomenal students who are superintendents. and assistant superintendents and principals. And so they know me. And I call them up a lot of times, say, hey, I have this program, what do you think? And that helps considerably. And then snowball sampling. So a lot of it's word of mouth, a lot of it's also having the standards, so identifying what's going to be really important. And then the third part of that stool is also me talking with teachers and having my team, and we have individuals who work, classroom teachers like myself, talking about their experiences, and that's a big selling point in terms of our validity. Yes?
So you said you wanted the students to be able to consider STEM as a competency and not necessarily as a career.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of science education is geared towards making scientists.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of NSF's support for science education is geared toward making more scientists. Do you get much pushback from your funders when you talk about it as a competency and not necessarily as a career, that somebody might want to do this but then go into marketing or some other field?
Mm-hmm. I don't get pushback so much, save for explain it a little better, Kim. And so what I like to do, there's been a couple analyses done in terms of what can we anticipate over the next 10 years in terms of competencies rather than careers. And so if we go back 10 years, a lot of the careers that are now called STEM didn't exist and they couldn't exist. But yet we know that the competencies are necessary for those careers. And so that's why I'm hesitant to say, all right, I want to get some of these kids in 10, 15, because as young as they are, to go into this field when we don't even know what the fields are in 10 years. I rather them have the computational thinking skills. I rather them have those competencies as to abstraction or decomposition, and then they can go into any career. And then if we think about the communities, what we do know unequivocally is, particularly for girls of color, social relevancy. Is if we look at some of the reasons as to why women and girls of color are not going into STEM careers, the traditional careers, there's lots of reasons. Hostile, I usually have a slide, but I didn't want to start off on a depressing note. But hostile environments, being pushed out at the graduate level. I mean, there's, we know why, right? But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily talk to competencies. It has to do with the sociocultural factors. And so, I'm more interested in the competencies, and not just the technical competencies, but as I said, also the social competencies is, how do I deal with unconscious bias? How do I deal with implicit bias? How do I deal with the fact, and this is true from the Double Jeopardy report, that African American women who are in STEM fields, traditional STEM fields, got their doctorates, some of them, got their masters, completed, but they are more likely to have to prove their competency in industry. How do I deal with the fact that if I'm Latina, the Double Jeopardy report was pretty clear that I have a greater likelihood, even though I have my PhD or I have my master's or I finished my bachelor's in a STEM career, I'm more likely to be asked to clean up at a meeting, literally, to be treated as the housekeeper, literally. So I'm more interested in competencies, again, along the technical as well as the social. Yes?
And what other fields are these issues present?
Every.
And everything. And so are you hoping to take this initiative beyond STEM at some point?
Yes. I think honestly, every field. And one thing that we see, if you ever get the chance, and you may have read this, the Tech Levers report. The Tech Levers report, it was a report commissioned and funded by the KAPOR Foundation, KAPOR, and it looked at individuals and as to why people left ed tech companies. And then they also looked at the impact of unconscious bias training in these ed tech companies and found they failed, that they are the worst thing that you could do in terms of changing the culture. And I think we've seen a lot of this in some of the social science literature. In education, if we look at higher education and that research in terms of my experience in higher education, irrespective of what discipline, a lot of the same microaggressions occur, whether it's in education or engineering. So again, I do believe, if we look at critical race theory, that racism is pervasive and it's persistent, and so is sexism and every other ism. And it's everywhere, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue the fight. And it's going to be a systemic change.
Yeah.
In a related vein, I was curious to hear, like, in those mentoring relationships, where the mentors were accidentally alienating all the students, like were there certain patterns in what they were saying that was not, was it about hostile work environment?
Oh yeah.
And how do you, like, remedy that in the training where you're kind of, like, honest with what's on the other end, but not scare them to the point they're not going to pursue that career path?
Yeah, what we found is that a lot of the mentors would just give the horror stories and without the solutions. So they would say, oh my gosh, this happened and that happened, this happened, but they didn't demonstrate how they overcame those obstacles. And so we played with that, and this is in the mentoring literature. Angela Byers-Winston at University of Wisconsin, she's done some phenomenal work, particularly on how to mentor underrepresented communities in STEM, and particularly sciences. And she said that the relationship, going back to the point of critical feminist theory, the power as relation, is so important in terms of not just setting a relationship based on a horror show, but setting a relationship of this happened to me, and this is what I did to overcome it, and it wasn't just me doing anything. It's me building that coalition. So we're playing with those ideas for the CompuPower and being really clear with the mentor. And mentoring is different than modeling, different than sponsorship also. So we're being really explicit. Now, how successful we will be, I'm on a pilot year, we'll see. Someone had a question over here? Okay, so knowledge. So I believe that that anything that we do programmatically in terms of implementing these enrichment experiences, we need to understand what we're doing, and we need to use, again, going back to the point that I said earlier, an intersectional approach, and not simply just looking at variables and breaking it down this way and saying, okay, well, this intergroup difference means this causality or correlation, but to really think about intersectionality as a framework to better understand power and access to power and resources. So in the knowledge arm, we have lots of really cool scholarship looking at the impact of our CompuGirls or CompuPower or the Learning in Libraries. This is a screenshot. I got a Bill and Melinda Gates grant, and it allowed us to look at African American tweens, teens, and families' use of technology outside of school. And we did a national survey of 1,000 dyads, so a little more than 2,000. We also did focus groups in 5 cities that have very large percentages of African Americans. And that actually happened before the survey because that informed the creation of the survey items. And then we came up with some, ideas in terms of how are African Americans not necessarily using technology, but using technology to innovate. Because we know it's one thing to drive the car. It's another thing to know how to build the car. And so we wanted to find out more about how we were innovating with technology. I won't go into depth with everything we found. The report is up there. But what I like to do is more research. So I worked with a graduate student and a postdoc here at ASU, and we did a deeper dive of the research and looking at the thousand points of data to say, what are some of the implications of social context, going back to that idea from critical feminist theory. So we were in a very rural part of Mississippi. And I wanted to say, well, are the experiences of African American girls in rural Mississippi similar to the experiences of African American girls in Oakland, California? Are they similar to the experiences of the African American boys? And then we broke it down in terms of family composition. And I'll just say very briefly, one thing we found, which is I thought really interesting, and we're still parsing the data, is that the male figure, a father figure, has a greater impact on the boy in terms of their technical the perception. So if I'm a boy, if my father encourages me to explore technology as an innovator, that has a greater impact than if I'm a girl or if it's my mother. At the same time, what we found in the focus group data is that both girls and boys, even if there were separate households because of a divorce, both girls and boys tended to go to their mother to troubleshoot tech.
That's how it is in my house. Can I ask you a question?
Please.
To that, the one you just moved back down. It seems when you're talking about schools that there's a bubble missing, and that would be teachers' competence with technology.
Yeah. Yeah, we didn't do that. Yeah, we didn't have enough. We didn't have enough money to do that. But my final report is due, and I have a whole list of things that we should be doing. But we were also interested because we do know, particularly for African Americans, and particularly for African American girls, some of the strongest levers in their lives are outside of school. Whether it be through the church, whether it be through a community organization, extended family, some of the strongest levers are outside of school. So that's why I thought it was really important to say what's going on outside of school as opposed to in school. Not to say that teachers aren't important, of course. Yes?
I'm curious on the kids going to their moms. Why? Did you study why?
No, they
Like,
didn't.
Were they more accessible?
I thought so, no.
Considered to be more friendly to approach?
No. I don't know. But we didn't delve deep enough into that.
Okay.
No, we didn't ask. I do know in the literature, I think it was, I don't remember who authored this, but that the mother's interaction with technology says a lot for how boys and girls, but this was normed with white middle class kids, that it says a lot to how boys and girls perceive other people's technological potential. Not so much the father. So again, this is why it was important for us to look specifically, and this was a sample of African Americans who are already online. So this was not a representative sample of every African American child between 11 and 17 years of age. It was 11 to 17 national representative sample online already. So I had to make that point clear. Talking a little bit about CompuGirls, because we do research in terms of saying, well, what's the effect of our program? How does it impact girls' general self-concept, how they perceive the importance of education, their social justice beliefs and actions, racial and gender self-efficacy. And we do a lot of pre and post surveys to see where they lie. The importance of education seems to be the biggest one. And so a lot of this has to do with the self-selection, because this is a voluntary program. CompuGirls, it's out of school. The girls are coming because they want to come. Usually it's not because they're forced to come, even though we have had the opportunity to work with some public housing and also some organizations where girls are forced to come and as part of their education, and the statistics really don't change that much. But I love qualitative statistics, and I really like seeing qualitative data, and I really like this quote, because we asked a girl, what did they learn? What did this individual learn as a result of the program? And she says, I've learned more about me. I've learned more about what it means to discriminate as a woman and discriminated by race. I was like, oh, intersectionality. I was hoping. But more specifically, how throughout the years most African Americans or black people have been not treated as fairly as white people, and how women are treated almost every day or in different kinds of media. I definitely knew it was there, but I didn't really know that much about it. And so we have other examples of these types of quotes where the young women are saying, I have language to name my experiences. And so they have this experience in CompuGirls, again, this culturally responsive technology program, and usually the biggest impact is on the social. The whole idea of learning the technical, that's easy. That's the easy, fun part. I can do that. But what's more important to them, and the reason that they keep coming back over and over again, sometimes to become near peer mentors, sometimes to become ASU students, and then to go back and become the mentor teachers, and sometimes to become staff members. And we're starting to have some young women who started in this first cohorts who are now graduating from ASU and now getting their PhDs, and these are young women, first generation, many high school in their family. It's because of the social aspect, and to the point said earlier, the peer impact. But yet parents are also really, really important to the girls. And I really think it's important for us to acknowledge that and to find out what are they thinking about. And so the point of that fallacy that certain communities are simply scared of technology, I never see that. Never. In all the years that I've been doing this, the girls are saying, my parents are really supportive. Sometimes, a lot of times, the parents don't necessarily have access to the resources as to how to be supportive. But their parents are still supportive. I'm conscious of time. So I'll just say for this, one of the things, again, if you recall, in terms of intersectionality is the social context. So we do try to parse the data in terms of geography. So when we have different sites across the United States, we look and see, well, how is one site doing in terms of the participants' understanding and the importance of education versus another, but more importantly, the courses. So we have 4 courses that we're always playing with as to, is it up to date? Should we change the technology? You know, should we use Raspberry Pi or Arduinos? Or, you know, what should we be doing? What we see is that certain courses have different types of effects in different areas. We've created the infrastructure for our own instrument, but we're continuously trying to validate it and also make it more reliable. And this is another great quote in terms of how we are encouraging girls to have conversations about race, not only amongst themselves, but also with others, and to do so fearlessly. I promise that some of the things that we're doing, that every action, every lesson has to be tethered to some theoretical construct. And so for our learning and librarians, we just developed this curriculum and we piloted it. So we took the 3 aspects of culturally responsive computing and then linked it to particular concepts, and then had specific lessons to exemplify these concepts. So it's very methodical how we're creating our curriculum for every single thing that we do, and this is why it's a team approach. We also often ask past Compu girls to participate in the program. One young woman who is an ASU graduate, she went through our Compu Girls program. She came here to ASU as an undergraduate student. She was first generation. She worked with us as an undergraduate research assistant. She consistently helps us develop and refine our curriculum. She graduated. She got a Fulbright. Her Fulbright is, her proposal was to take one portion of our program, translate it into Spanish, and teach it in one of the highest needs districts in Mexico City. She did it. She came back. She worked with us this summer again to help us with CompuPower. Guess what? She's now supervising Fulbrights back in Mexico City. So she just left a week ago. She comes back, and then she's going to pursue her PhD. Her PhD, she wants it to be in, she said, computer science and critical race theory. And I said, oh, we'll find you a program. With the CompuPower program, similarly, we're looking at indicators. It's mainly quantitative, thanks to AIR, who's doing the evaluation. We have lots of different data sources. But I want to end with advocacy, because I believe that we can do all this great research. We can do all this great program building. But unless decision makers, and not just decision makers such as the federal government, but unless the post-secondary folk, the people who are in the high schools, the individuals who are community, top and grassroots leaders, unless those individuals have access to our findings, and so that we make them accessible, not only giving it to them, but make it in a way that they care about, then we're just spinning our wheels. So the advocacy arm, we do a lot of convenings and bringing stakeholders together, presenting what we're doing, but having a facilitated dialogue in terms of how can we do it better and how can we do it in terms of a coalition. So the Women of Color STEM Entrepreneurship Conference, Dr. Stanley James was a speaker at that conference. We'll have it again this year. It's always here at ASU. We have a hackathon, and we always need assistance with the hackathon. We just had a policy writing workshop where a fellow at Brookings, who's also a fellow in my center, and thanks to SFIS, co-hosted this. we'll have it again. And then we have the STEM equity exchanges. You're all invited. If you look at ASU now, it's next Tuesday. And that's really for the local community because, again, I really am cautious about creating programs that are almost only focused on the victim, so to speak, that we really need to create programs for those decision makers, whether they be deans, chairs, provosts, or presidents. If you hold on to your question, I will make sure to get to it, but I just want to get to this last slide. Some of the upcoming things that we're doing, instrument development, because how do we know what we're doing? There is not an instrument, to the best of my knowledge, that assesses culturally responsive computational thinking. More or less, is there an instrument that assesses computational, culturally responsive computational thinking that is sensitive to African American, Native American, Latina, and Asian American, girls and boys. And so we are doing an exploratory study on instrument development. Destination database. Need I say more? I'm very excited about that. I won't steal my colleague's thunder. Culturally responsive engineering, we're playing with new types of curriculum, particularly manufacturing, so getting the girls to create their robots and code their robots using a 3D printer that would still solve a problem. And then more policy work. I have an idea for a postdoctoral plan that is more systems. And then I'd like to finish my book. In all my free time, but I do have a contract on a book specifically about copy roles. And that's it. Questions, comments? Yes?
I was wondering during your work with the kids, if you found a need for, has there been interest from the parents and particularly the moms to learn more, or what the current learning?
Yes. Yes, we 1 year had concurrent sessions where the girls would come and then the parents would be taking the American Dream Academy class. And that was wildly successful. 100% participation, the attrition rate was 0. That was really, so we, again, in my experience, I have not had issues. In fact, I do have data where some of the girls in the earlier cohorts would, their parents, particularly the fathers, they would say, we have different conversations with our daughters. All of a sudden they're coming and talking to us about social justice issues. First of all, they're coming to talk to us because they're teens. That's exciting. Seriously, I mean, they weren't having conversations and then all of a sudden they're coming and talking about serious issues and in a way that makes sense, that they're thinking through these issues. Yeah.
So you mentioned how they were encouraging you to become more gender neutral in the program.
Mm-hmm.
But do you see that as somehow diminishing the message that you're trying to send?
Yes and no. I think that, and this is why when naming the center, I said gender and not Center for Women, is because I think we need to, in particular, we need to work on cultivating male allies as well as working with girls and women. So that's one point. At the same time, the reason why the Department of Education really said you need to make it gender neutral, I didn't agree with. They said two things. They said the lawyers say Title IX. I said, what about Title IX? They said, well, if you're going to do this in schools, you're violating Title IX. And I said, I don't think so. They said, well, you have to make it gender neutral. I said, fine. And they said Title VI. Have you ever heard of Title VI? I've never heard of Title VI. I said, Title VI, what's that? And they said, well, you have in a lot of your material that this is a program for girls of color. Are you going to prevent white girls from attending? I said, well, disproportionately, the kids who are in the schools that we are, the fortunate guests are African American and Latina and Native American, but I said, white is a color. They didn't like that response. So I rolled my eyes. I said, no, we're not going to prevent any girl from, attending because of their race. It's about underrepresentation.
Yeah.
And if we look at, again, this is why I think intersectional approaches are so important. If we look at social class as just one variable, we do see that upper class, so to speak, the 1% of society, women are not going into STEM fields as much as at the other end. So white upper class women are underrepresented in STEM. Yeah, really, really interesting. Which again leads me in terms of looking at more of the system. One piece of our research is also working with the elite colleges and working more with them in terms of what they're doing and how can they expand it.
Just locally, have you looked at high schools to see how they have their STEM program structured? Because I know from my experience, you aren't in an honors AP program, you're not in a STEM program. Anybody that's not in an honors AP program wouldn't even be given the option. It wouldn't even be offered to any of the regular mainstream students. So it seems to me that the school systems there's a deficit in the way they offer STEM
Yes.
training to all of their students overall.
Absolutely, absolutely. However, the college boards, they did an assessment of as many high schools as they could in terms of providing AP computer science courses, more or less the exam. And what did we see? That in the high needs areas, the likelihood of having even a course in computer science was less. I was going to show the slide, but I didn't. There is a slide that changed the equation created for me specific to Arizona. And we have, some of you I think have seen this slide, we have incredible growth for STEM, but we are like number 48, 49, 50 in terms of our high schools providing resources in school and after school. We are number 48, 49, 50.
Matches our state
Yeah.
education.
Yeah, it really does.